Thank you, Jeff, and thank all of you for coming out on a snowy day to listen to us. I know all of you can read the report, so I'm not going to tell you what's in it, but I am going to comment on my 40 years of dealing with energy policy issues. I got involved in energy in 1974, so I've seen a lot of policy proposals and policy acts and presidential statements over that period of time. And for the most part, they have been based on illusions, wishful thinking, and a philosophy that prevails too much in this town. I hate to say this with all the congressional staff members here, but there's a philosophy that's like the field of dreams. If we will it, it'll happen. And it hasn't. And energy policy has been dominated by political forces that have tried to substitute for market forces. And with each of the major initiatives that's taken place, they've all had the same objective. They've all failed. And by that, they meet the definition of insanity, doing the same thing over and over and expecting a different result. Next slide, Jeff. So I'm going to give a retrospective review based on my experience. The first major energy policy act was President Nixon's Project Independence. And since then, there have been a series of them, at least 7, and they've all embodied wrong-headed policies, and those have been bipartisan. It is not the domain of either Democrats or Republicans. They both share in using illusions to advance their political agendas. Most people, especially those in the energy industry, recognize that Project Independence made absolutely no economic, environmental, or technological sense. But it has remained a major national goal, and in the process, there have been 40 years of subsidies for various types of energy or alternatives to fossil fuel. And what they've done is waste billions, perhaps hundreds of billions of dollars, and promote, particularly in the last decade, a growth in crony capitalism. All of this is recognized by members of Congress, presidents, but there's simply no political will to curtail them because they're beneficiaries in states and districts who need to be satisfied. The environment continues to improve in spite of rhetoric to the contrary. And I think most recently of Secretary of State Kerry's statement about climate change being a weapon of mass destruction, or the president saying that new tailpipe emissions will curtail carbon pollution and lead to changing climate change, which is having an adverse impact on the world. If any of you think that I'm engaging in hyperbole, look up work done by Ben Zeiker at the American Enterprise Institute, where he used one of the climate models and did a calculation that if the U.S. reduced its emissions by 80%, the impact on global temperatures in 2100 would be 1/10 of a degree. One of the foundations for most energy policy acts was a belief that we were running out of oil, that it was a finite resource. And if you look at that list, it goes back well over 100 years. And no matter whether the technique was a simple engineering model or a big computer model, the forecasts were always the same, that this was a finite resource and that we would soon be out of it. In fact, it became an official government policy in the 1970s that by the end of the century, we would run out of oil. At that time, worldwide proved reserves were 645 billion barrels. We have consumed since then over 1 trillion barrels, and there's about 1.5 trillion of still proven reserves. So it's not a finite resource, and Mark wrote a book called The Bottomless Barrel, and he may talk more about that. Go to the next slide. This reflects my views on the flaws of energy policy. And the first one goes back to oil. Geologists have long believed, petroleum geologists have long believed that oil was, there was an organic theory that decaying dinosaurs and plant life were the source of petroleum. I don't know how many still hold that view, but there's a shift towards organic theory of the formation of hydrocarbons, and the deep methane hydrates probably are one piece of evidence that it wasn't decaying plants and dinosaurs. But in the policy process, there's been too much emphasis placed on static conditions, where if something is enacted in law or regulation, nothing else happens. But the world's dynamic and the market system's dynamic, and as you change the system, the incentives, behaviors change. As prices of crude oil went up, there were incentives to develop new technology to find oil that wasn't economically producible 15 years ago. But in all of these acts, the one thing that has certainly happened is there's been an increase in the concentration in power in Washington, D.C. over the oil and gas industry or the energy industry, and using subsidies to dictate the type of energy that ought to be produced in the future. We're enjoying a renaissance in oil and gas production, not because of anything that happened in Washington, but because of what's happening on private lands as a result of technology developed by the private sector. I think it's unfortunate that many in the private sector, businesses, have gone along with these policy initiatives because they have found it easier to earn profit through the regulatory system than in the marketplace. And I think that is a serious danger. I like to refer to it as a form of cancer. There's also, and I really don't mean to insult congressional staff members, but in Washington, in the White House, and in Congress, what I've observed is excessive arrogance. That there are people here who believe they're smart enough to manage economic activities and shape economic outcomes and to dictate what type of energy you and your children will be consuming in the decades ahead. In the 40 years, they haven't produced those alternatives in a commercially viable, scalable manner. And when you look across to see at Europe, at Germany and Spain, the other nations over there that have attempted to promote their green economy, their economies have suffered, and the citizens in Germany, I think, pay the highest electricity prices in the world, or at least the developed world. If you would like to know why I'm so cynical, I'll refer you to the 1974 Nobel acceptance speech by Friedrich Hayek that dealt with the pretense of knowledge. And a little bit of humility would go a long way in terms of improving our policy process. Next slide. As I said at the beginning, one of the reasons that these policy initiatives have failed is that there's been an effort to substitute politics and illusions for economic, energy, and technology realities. And in the end, it may increase the cost, but you simply can't repeal laws of physics or engineering or human behavior. And so fossil fuels are going to continue to dominate for at least the next 30 years. And as a friend of mine once said, the Stone Age didn't end when we ran out of stones, and the oil age will not end when we run out of oil. It'll end when technology and economics make some alternative preferable. One of the things I've advocated for a long time, I don't know that I'll live long enough to ever see it, is some provision in law and in regulations for a look-back provision. Laws get passed, they get on the book, they get encased in concrete, and no one ever goes back and says, well, what did we learn from that? And what changes ought we to make to improve what we wanted to accomplish? There's also the assumption, and it's reflected in the RFS system, of the ability to do long-term planning in energy. Of course, to do any kind of economic long-term planning is futile, but the RFF provisions set out volume and timelines and technologies that were to be used, and none of those were accomplished. And I'm reminded of a paper that the former Secretary of Energy, Secretary of Defense, and CIA Director Jim Schlesinger wrote when he was an analyst at the RAND Corporation. He wrote a chapter in a book on defense economics that dealt with R&D planning. And he described two types of planning. One he called Cook's Tour, which is analogous to going on a vacation. If you want to go around the world, you can book your flights, you can book your hotels, everything you can book because the level of uncertainty is small. On the other hand, when Thomas Jefferson sent Lewis and Clark to explore the West, he had an objective and limited knowledge of how to get there, so it was an incremental process of taking knowledge that you have, acting on it, investing in developing new knowledge, and acting on that. And I submit that our energy policy and a lot of other policies would be better served if we took small bites of things we understood, invested in new information, and then changed our direction. That may be impossible in our system, but it is a dream that I have. Have the next one. You'll find
good to have good dreams.
better than nightmares. These principles are reflected throughout the report that you have. The most important to me is the recognition that energy is an economic input. If it's abundant and reasonably priced, it contributes to job creation and economic growth. If it's made scarce and artificially too expensive, it just has the opposite effects. So we should be for abundant, affordable energy, independent of what type it is. And I'd just like to end with three realities. One I've already mentioned. Fossils are going to remain dominant for decades to come. The world will not turn away from them because there are so many people that live in abject poverty that want to improve their standards of living. They're going to do that by consuming fossil energy. The second is that we need strong R&D programs where the public sector knows what the limits are for its investment in research and technology, and it tries to collaborate with the private sector to produce outcomes that are economic and commercially viable. And the third and final one is markets work. And you can't repeal the laws of economics and market forces. They work. They work sometimes better, sometimes poorly. It depends on the underlying policies of government. Thank you.